I was thinking it's really wet out today, isn't it? It's like really raining.
The hell does that have to do with this?
Well, I bet there's a lot of waves on the lake. I wouldn't want to be in a boat. I don't think you'd want to be on a boat anywhere on the East Coast today.
Okay.
Anyway. All right, today we're going to talk about something like that, actually. We're going to talk about damping and back waves, I guess particularly on planar drivers. There's no real specific question, just brought up some topics to us to talk about. So I guess it's a free-for-all, whatever the hell we want to discuss about back waves from a planar driver or any driver.
So we could cover the general gist of things. Of course, if you have a driver, it makes audio, but it makes audio in both directions, right? Both the front side that goes towards your ear and the back part. So on a closed back headphone, that's sealed in a little box. You need to do something to mitigate, otherwise it bounces around, creates a mess, right? It kind of cancels out the sound that goes to your ear. On open back headphones, the reason why they tend to perform better is because it's a little bit easier. It's a little bit more advantageous to dump the sound out the back. Because then you have basically comparatively a infinite space behind the headphone rather than the small confined space.
Unfortunately, in the real world, it's not infinite because there's always something back there.
Always problems.
For sound to reflect off of.
Yeah. You always have some degree of acoustic impedance past the driver,
and
right?
Reflections and
there's always a chassis, a housing, some mounting system, some physical structure, magnets, wiring.
Which means the acoustic back wave or the acoustic pressure off the rear of the driver doesn't fully get eliminated.
Right.
Some of it gets back to your ear, messes with the brain.
Yep.
Well, when we were initially making 1266, we never had anything on the back. We didn't have a frame. It was just drivers in free air. So they're kind of always developed.
There's a 4-inch black hole.
With nothing on the back.
Yeah. We kind of had a bit of a backwards approach from that. I guess we designed it with, more or less tuned the driver with nothing behind it.
Yeah.
And so that's what we were targeting, the minimum restriction to the back wave. And traditionally with planar magnetics especially, a lot of people have particular frequency ranges that they need to do something about, that needs to be adjusted because the driver intrinsically has some degree of resonance somewhere, which you're always going to have. It's just a question of how bad it is and where it is, what frequency range.
And we should probably also expand on it that all drivers have resonant frequencies.
Yeah, of course,
They'll act funny at certain frequencies.
Certain frequencies, yeah.
So what and I mean, obviously the perfect driver would not, which rarely exists. So what you normally see is, what you always see is with headphone designers and speaker designers and all kinds of designers is they use some sort of absorptive material or damping material internally to absorb that, let's call it excess energy that shouldn't get to your ear because it's an overload. It's a resonant character of the material that it's got like a peak in its resonance where it's acting up, so to speak. So they dampen it with material internally, which absorbs more or less more of a wide banded range of frequencies.
Yep. The challenge with that is, just like drivers tend to never be perfect, damping materials are never perfect. So you're trying to tailor design it to tune out a particular frequency or minimize a peak or shift around some tonality.
Which is usually very narrow.
Right, but it has an impacts above sometimes and below the frequency ranges, and it causes other issues outside of frequency response alone.
Now, let's say you want to wipe out a problem at like 5 to 6 kilohertz or something like that, right? Somewhere in between there, or probably even more narrow than that. Let's say 5.5K or something, right? Just making up a number. So you put a material in order that is obviously absorptive at that frequency, but it's probably absorptive at 1K through 10K or 12K or more, so you're putting material in there to solve the problem at a specific frequency, but it's actually affecting a huge range of frequencies, which alters the sound, and so you're skewing the balance, which on some stuff is probably okay. I mean, you wouldn't know it.
Well, yeah.
You wouldn't know it being the listener. You don't know what the internals are, or how they're made, or why they do what they do. You just know the final sound. So.
Well, a lot of times there's multiple materials stacked or in some sort of fashion adhere to the chassis or the driver itself to do these things. So it's not just like one thing that's influencing the sound. There's all kinds of different styles and thicknesses and sizes of material. Sometimes it's not covering the whole driver, only portions of the driver where there's really in excess of an issue, or I mean, there's a million different ways.
Mesh materials could be
You
put
could
in
do
there
this,
that,
right?
that restrict the driver at low frequencies or restrict air motion, so you could use like a denser mesh or, fine mesh that you could still kind of see through.
Right.
But it's still being restrictive and keeping the driver from.
This is one of the biggest
acting up.
challenges, though, when making a headphone. The tuning of it, making the driver actually output the perfect frequency response without impacting everything else, without impacting the perceived detail. And I mean, there's really a lot of nuance that you could lose just by adding damping material. And some people wouldn't agree with this one, but you typically can over damp something and it produces a more desirable frequency response, but it's less pleasing to listen to.
Yeah, right.
There's other issues. There's less perceived detail.
You know what the measurements look like when you do that, right?
Yeah. Well,
Right.
and what it sounds like.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's like a too much of a good thing.
Yeah.
You just get down this rabbit hole of damping and trying to,
Yeah.
fix one spot, and then in the end, you don't realize that it's like, oh, this is what I wanted to
Yeah,
sound
fire
like.
is
Yeah,
smooth.
yeah, right.
No bumps.
Yeah.
Right.
But the headphone sounds like
Sounds
dead.
bad, yeah.
Yeah, you like wiped out all the
Yeah.
So it's a balance.
small details.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of our viewers are aware of this. There's plenty of people definitely that mod their own headphones. They
Yeah.
jam a bunch of stuff in there and try things out, and that's cool. And maybe you could tailor it a little bit more to your taste, or maybe you could take a cheap headphone and make it sound better. But making world-class performance with tuning, that's really tough. really tough.
And
Obviously,
earpads can even do that
That's a
too,
big
like
struggle.
the material that the earpads are made of.
Perforated or not.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like on the Dianas, we went to every material we could find for the mesh on the front and listened to them all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're all a little different.
Right.
It's not night and day, obviously,
Right.
but yeah, they all.
It is to us.
Yeah, well, yeah, well.
like, no, we don't wanna
that's
go
all
there.
you're focusing on, yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, that's the thing. People would probably not be entirely aware of that, but
No.
even outside of the driver, the entire system needs to be taken into account. So the earpads matter a fair bit. You need to have the earpads you're going to use to get the rest of the tuning right. And if there's mesh, protective mesh between the driver and your ear, that needs to be in place because that's going to change the driver's
Yeah.
response.
Or you can remove that and see what happens, right? It's hard to put back.
But if you're going to tune it,
Once you remove it, it's game over.
if you're
But
tuning it
yeah.
as is for a stock product,
Yeah.
yeah, you kind of need
You
these
can
things for
modify
mechanical
it.
protection.
You'd modify the original design of we're talking higher end headphones.
Yeah.
The $20 jobbers, you can do whatever the hell you want to it. You just always buy another one.
Well, yeah.
But on the higher end, I think most companies are fine tuning this thing with all these materials, and
Right.
at least they should be.
I would hope.
Yeah. The other thing to talk about too would be you can also dampen the actual driver itself by putting doping materials or some sort of coatings on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, though, you are changing the characteristic sound of and resonance of that material.
Mhm.
So it can go either way. Once again, you can solve some problems and create others, which you know about that with our metallization process and stuff like that. You've played with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it makes a surprising difference, depending on what you put on. I mean, it's what's producing the sound, so I guess it would have the most impact,
Yeah.
the physical diaphragm itself.
Particularly at certain frequencies,
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
you can get, like in music, you can get a combination of frequencies that just rattle the driver. You get just a mix of stuff at relatively high levels for the frequency range, and a harmonic structure, like someone pounding on a piano, at the low end of the piano and the high end at the same time or something like that. Or I've heard, I recall someone playing a trumpet, and they'll put something like a mute in front of it, or maybe they'll have a certain mouthpiece. I don't know. I don't play trumpet. But it sounds like they're spitting into it, right? And
Right.
that actually creates, from a waveform standpoint, it creates a triangle wave, which is extremely weird. You don't normally see that type of waveform, and it's basically it's consisted of very high frequency energy and low frequency energy depending on what note he's playing. And it again, when you get a combination of things in there, you create a kind of almost an intermodulation distortion or something, and where the driver just playing single frequency a sweep tone, you'd never notice it.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden you get this music passage that has multiple things going on, and the driver acts weird, and there's certain tracks that set it off. And those things are hard to deal with, and I think almost every driver pretty much is going to have something go on, some combination of frequencies like that.
Yes. So I suppose there's a few things to note here. Traditionally with headphones, most people look at what I would call mechanical damping. And so it's adding things on. The sound's created and you try to get rid of it after the fact, right? You're putting things in the way to absorb, diffuse, reflect, whatever, to minimize the negativity of this particular frequency range. But there's also other forms of dampening, right? So we have very little of what I would call the mechanical dampening. Our driver's pretty much free air behind it. We just have on 1266 the foamed aluminum, which is acoustically very low impedance, and it's rather transparent to both light and
Yeah, to most
acoustics.
frequencies, when we started working with this material, we found that we could, adjusting its porosity, thickness, things like that, and setting it for our driver, we can make it so that it was almost equivalent, if not damn near equivalent, we know the difference of having nothing at all back
Right.
there, which was amazing to us because
Right.
everything had a sound. And, wood cut with a pattern open. You think something's open, and you see a lot of space there, like
Yeah.
a backside has a bunch of openings, but.
Yeah, those early 1266 with the wood. Yeah, we had different thicknesses of wood, and then it would completely change.
Yeah.
Just the same
Yeah.
pattern, but just
You'd
different.
stack
different
with one,
thickness,
two,
yeah.
or three
Yeah.
layers, and as
Yeah.
it got thicker, it would
Yeah, it
start
sounded
messing with
different.
you.
right. You're
Yeah.
kind of sort of tuning
Even
the
though it was
port length.
open. Yeah, right.
Right.
It's
But
almost
that
like
makes a big
creating
difference. It makes a
ports.
Yeah.
big difference
Yeah.
Yeah.
in the tuning. You could just make the slots deeper,
Yeah.
and it totally changes
Yeah.
the
But
sound.
you wouldn't think it would really do that, but it did it.
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know?
And the different kinds of wood sounded different.
Yeah, right. The material, the way they resonated, because you're hearing reflections off. No matter what you do, there's always something there that reflects sound off the back that comes back to your ear.
Yeah.
You're never 100% open unless there's absolutely nothing there but air.
Yeah.
So you're always going to hear something. And the real trick, at least it's a big trick, it's a parlor trick to be able to do it, is to make that something sound like nothing. It's like listening to an open window.
Yeah.
You open a window and you just hear out the window in front of you, right? Versus there being glass or a wall there,
Right.
where you hear things coming off the glass or wall.
Well, glass is
And try
particularly
to create
bad.
a wall. Try to create a window out of a wall is very difficult to do.
Yeah. So that's a challenge with
I
things
mean, an
like
open
closed back.
window.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
try to create an open window
Right.
out of a wall.
Yeah, right.
It's very difficult.
You
to
have a
do.
physical thing there. You want it to sound like nothing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you make that invisible without distracting the sound, without
Right.
absorbing too much information. Because obviously, if you're going to make something sound like it's not there, you have to remove it somehow. Acoustic will remove it.
Right.
So diffusion's been used in the past, like in rooms. They use diffusers to try to do that, to bounce the sound in all different directions to kind of minimize any effect of one particular reflection, where you're causing reflections in all angles, all kinds of angles simultaneously, so it doesn't sound as much as all the sound coming off of one angle, or diffusion, or absorption, where you're absorbing sound, and it's kind of the same thing. I don't know, some people in the 2-channel world have probably played with panels in rooms, foam panels and stuff
Yeah.
like that, absorptive materials, and I don't know if anyone's ever bought enough of it to take it to a degree where it kills the room. You remember what happens when you take it to that degree, where you'll throw X amount of panels in a room,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, so many square feet of foam per the square foot of room, as a percentage or so, right? And I don't know if you remember when we were playing with our other sound room at the old place.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Were you part of that?
I remember you talking about it, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, what occurs is you get to a point where you're putting foam panels and hang on a wall. Let's say they're 2 foot by 4 foot, right? You're putting them in a room, and you don't have to hang them. You just say lay them against the wall,
Yeah.
right? And you start adding. You bring them into the room while music is playing, and you bring them in the room, and you start to notice the room getting quieter. As reflections getting down, the image starts to get a bit more specific if you sit down in a sweet spot, because now you're starting to tame the walls from having sound bounce around and mess with your brain, because your brain's trying to recreate this center image. And it has a difficult time doing that because it's hearing reflections from behind it and everything. It's messing with the actual direct signal off the speakers. So anyway, if you have enough of these foam panels, which, everyone costs $50 to $100 or more, so most people probably don't have that many, but you start adding it in a room, and you reach a point all of a sudden where you'll bring one more panel in, and the room just dies. Like, it just sounds like bad. Like, shit, I don't hear anything anymore. Like, the highs just drop out. And it's almost like that. It's like one panel too many, and boom, it goes. away. And that, I think, is so easy to do within a headphone space, because you're dealing with such a small space, and people tend to use large objects to put in there to solve problems, and it's just it's a very crude way to solve a small problem, but unfortunately it's many times the only way to do it, other than redesigning a driver,
Yeah, a lot of manufacturers, they have a standard driver design, or they have somebody else design the driver, or they're using a stock off-the-shelf driver, and they're tuning their headphone to make that driver work. And you absolutely could achieve wonderful results with that, but we have a very backwards approach. We design the driver to be as close to perfect as we can, which seems logical, but if you look at other headphone manufacturers, they tend to not do it this way. We put effectively the dampening in the driver without having any of those passive materials. I don't know how deep we want to get into this, but we have effectively magnetic and thermal damping built into the diaphragm.
Right.
Which is, my understanding, very atypical.
Well, I think not to correct you, but you mentioned something about most manufacturers don't do this. Manufacturers of drivers do attempt to obviously make perfect drivers.
Well, right, yeah, that's a good clarification.
But they're never
not
perfect.
making the headphone, right? So
yeah,
it's a different
right.
thing.
Yeah. And even if they did make, like some companies are obviously they're making drivers specific for a headphone. They are doing that. They are trying, but you're right. The driver is the driver.
Right.
And now they're basically sticking it into a headphone position.
Right.
And trying to tame it down so that it's listenable.
Right.
And it happens a lot more than I think people think, because it is extremely difficult to get a combination of materials in the driver to eliminate all problems and resonances.
Yeah.
It's damn near impossible.
It's kind of like the same thing as like an Android phone or an iOS phone, right? If you have the hardware and the software design simultaneously, there's a lot of optimizations that can be done. You can do more with less. And so a lot of times, if you have somebody else designing something, it could be wonderful, it could be great, it could actually be superior. But in the physical implementation, when it's a done, finished product achieving the desired result, in this case, a headphone, it doesn't always mean you get a better finished product because you started with a better component, right? The entire system, the entire chain is the important thing. And if you have somebody else designing it, maybe they made a compromise that leaned a little bit too far in a direction you didn't want to go.
Right.
That's what it's all about,
and then
right?
Now you got to compensate for that.
Now you got to compensate after the fact.
Which I'm sure happens all the time.
Sure.
We know because it's easy. That's the easy fix. Is that okay? We got a couple problems, but they're minor, and we can compensate for it. But that also is what strips away sonic information and that very, very tiny subtle details that recreate the sense of live and realism in space, and
the trouble is in this ultra high end in the flagship class, that's the important stuff. That's what matters.
Yeah, that's what they're looking for.
So it's not like, well, this is a wonderful headphone, one of the best. You absolutely could achieve that doing this kind of method, doing it a conventional way. But if you want to have the best, a lot of times it's really only practical if you're doing something nobody else is, if you're really working outside of the box.
Another thing to note too, I think, on damping is the electronics. Like the amps kind of help with that.
Well, yeah.
Bigger is better typically on a
electrical damping.
Yeah, right, which helps in the low frequency range.
Yeah.
I know some people say, it doesn't matter, and amp manufacturers, from a standpoint of technicality, say, you only need a damping factor of whatever the hell they say. I don't know.
Everybody has a different number.
Yeah, right. 5, 10. But in reality, we found in general that the bigger amps tend to really give you more of a control over the drivers, and by offering an electrical damping. Really gripping the driver and allowing and just keeping it in control at the extreme low frequencies. So that's part of the system damping too, and you can hear that on speakers. You can hear that a lot of times where you got, there's a lot of confusion with amplifier power and the speaker design too. And you have a lot of speakers that aren't perfectly damped, where they're either underdamped and overdamped. So they're either, when a bass note hits it, they either boom, flab out and they're loose, or they're too taut. And the bass note just gets quenched by the suspension of the driver and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, and in either case, the type of amplifier used with that either or speaker changes the bass characteristic, the way the bass sounds. If you take an underdamped speaker and mix it with a really high power amp, it's going to help the speaker to sound tauter because the speaker's running loose to begin with. So the bigger amplifier. Whereas if you put a tube amp on it, it sounds looser. The bass sounds woolly.
Right.
It gets boo, and so I've seen that in one of the tube amps years ago. I played with one of the tube amps had actually a variable feedback control, and as you adjust the feedback control from whatever minimum to max is, you noted that on a loudspeaker that the way the bass sound completely changed. You also changed the sense of openness, or the way the amp sounded. When you increase feedback, you dropped the openness or the sound. The sound got flat.
Yeah.
So there was this trade-off between how taut or how fast I want the bass on the feedback control versus how much openness I want out of this thing, and they were contradictory on the feedback, which is a cool thing about seeing how something as simple as how much feedback you put in an amp controls the sound quality in many ways, other than just calling it feedback. But anyway, that's just a tidbit.
I think that's one of those things that is definitely different from other headphone manufacturers to us, because we seem to more or less rely on the fact of having the electrical impedance being relatively low, the electrical damping factor being very good, intrinsic in the driver design. And on 1266, this tends to not be a problem at all. You tend to run it on high power gear. Like that just tends to be how people work anyways, right? High end, you're looking for flagship sound. You tend to have high power nonetheless. You're running flagship gear.
They're not 200 milliwatt flea amps.
Right, but that's the challenge,
we're talking
right?
multi-watt amps.
If you have a very low power amp, that's effectively why we made something like Diana V2. It's more tailored to that kind of thing. It's a little bit better suited to have the more intrinsic damping built into the diaphragm,
right.
So you don't need to have it electrically or otherwise.
And that Diana, too, is a different design and damping altogether in terms of it does have its backside's quite different. It's not foam aluminum.
Yeah.
It's a whole pattern.
Yeah, but really, I guess the bottom line is all these things are very important. Every factor is important. The cable, the connectors, the design, the shape, the style, the interior volume, the expected use case, the expected customer, how they're going to wear it and use it, the environment they're going to use it. Like really all this stuff matters a great deal.
At this level.
Right. If you're trying to design the best, it makes a difference. And everything's always just optimizing everything to the best of your ability.
And that's why we do
knowing
these videos.
The customers.
Right? We
Pretty
do these
much
videos to instruct people as to why this stuff matters. Right? This is why it matters. I'm just making this crap up. This is called experience, and it saves a lot of time. I mean, when you think about it, if you know these things and you understand the interactions, it saves you a lot of time as a consumer or even a professional user in trying to find out on your own. I mean, this stuff takes years. If you didn't know this stuff, no one told you.
Yeah.
And you just throw a headphone into an amplifier in a room.
Right.
Where would you be? Lost. That would be the answer. Because I mean, maybe it would sound good to you, but you'd have no idea why or what to do to optimize or even the path to take or where to begin looking.
It is very surprising in this industry how much information is shrouded in secrecy, seemingly. How much stuff is just on a forum or something like that. It's considered to be widespread knowledge, so nobody talks about it.
If you read 1,000 plus pages of stuff.
If you pay attention for years
and
and
try to
years.
decipher the information out of that.
But you come in as a newcomer, and a lot of times you don't know. Nobody says it because it seems to be so obvious to everybody that's been doing it for years.
Right.
And so there's so much stuff you miss out on. And so
most of the guys are pretty good on the threads, our threads in particular, I know,
Yeah, sometimes.
They're good at educating. They can tell the difference between somebody that's new at it versus somebody that's been doing
Usually
it.
they say I'm new.
Yeah, well,
so it's like,
which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, I remember being new.
People are even more helpful when they know that.
I remember when we were first starting to look at what everybody else was doing when we were developing 1266. We didn't know any of the amp manufacturers or
what few there were.
Yeah, right. And I mean, it was daunting in the beginning. And now you just take it for
the terminology was different
for granted
than speakers and stuff. Yeah.
That you've been in the industry so long that you know all these things.
You don't think anything of it.
You don't think anything
right.
of it. Yeah, but there was a point where we didn't know anything.
Right. It was a while ago.
Yeah.
But we had and really, if you think about it, this end of the industry was in its infancy at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, when you looked around, nobody knew anything about it.
Yeah.
Very few people.
Yeah, the high end.
Yeah, that just didn't exist.
Yeah.
There was only a handful of guys designing gear for the pinnacle of performance, like the ultra high end stuff. It was really new.
Less than a handful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A few people doing it, and there really wasn't much talk about it. There weren't many people buying it.
Remember there's that one 10 grand tube amp? Was it 10 grand, that one
Yeah.
tube amp? Which didn't really sound that appealing for
Right.
us with our headphone. It was just too soft sounding. It sounded like a traditional tube amp. And then Cavelli was working on the liquid gold, and
Yeah.
we finally got some power. We hooked up with him, and that's the power we needed to really showcase what we could do. But beyond that, there was nothing.
Wu made one pair of monoblocks.
That's
at that
true.
point.
They had the one pair. Yeah, that went around
Yeah.
from show. Yeah, that one only.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was no one buying anything like that, because what the hell would you use it with?
Yeah.
Right?
But
There
now
was-
look at the industry.
yeah.
There's a bunch of high-end manufacturers making all different high-end headphones, all different high-end amplifiers, and people are actually buying them. People are using them. People are really enjoying this stuff and getting into
Absolutely.
it.
Well, it's great to have a selection.
Yeah.
Hell, we're always looking for some new toys.
Yeah.
You know?
And actually, I think it's important to note the low end is improving too. The low end's getting
yeah.
cheaper and better at
Agreed.
the same price. So some people get upset to see these high-priced things, and maybe they think, well, now it's harder for me to attain the best of the best. But the low end, the mid-range, all of it tends to be getting better and cheaper.
Right.
So yeah, there are more expensive amps than ever. But on top of that, there's better mid-range
Yeah.
and low end than ever.
Agreed, which is great.
Everything's getting
Because
better.
now everyone can hear the music better.
We're pretty deep into this one.
Yeah, we're getting deeper, and we could go
Let's probably just clip it off here.
Yeah.
This will go another
a
hour.
few drinks. We could go really deep. So,
Oh boy.
yeah, I'm thinking I'm
We'll
gonna
save
need
it for a
drink tonight.
future episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks everyone for watching, and please give us a thumbs up if you like what we're doing, and subscribe to us so you know what's coming up all the time. Take care of yourselves.
Take care.